Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Happy Sunday, everybody. How's everybody doing? I hope you said fine. Coming down off that Christmas stuff, you know. My name is Charlotte. I'm going to be your host. Let me get my chat up. There we go. I'm going to be your host for the next hour. I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento. We're 45 strong up and down the state, which means if you have a paranormal need or you think you do, contact us and we'll get out there and help you out. Okay? Today is Reading Sunday, or Sunday Reading Day. Sunday Reading Day. And we've been reading from this fantastic book. I read it last year by Sylvia Shuts. It's The Spirits of Christmas, the Darkside of the Holidays. And it's not all about Christmas. Like I said, it's the holidays. It's about the holidays in general. So what I'm going to do for an hour, I'm going to read from this book. We may finish the book off today. You know, I don't know. But I'm going to read from this book for about an hour, and that's going to be it today. Okay, there won't be any card readings or anything tonight. I'm taking the night off. I'm going to go enjoy some Christmas dinner. Okay, I'm going to go out to dinner. In the meantime, let's get to cracking on this. And let me grab some water real quick because I didn't fill my water up. Let me fill some water up real quick before I start, and off we go. So welcome, everyone. My house, we celebrate till like mid-February for Christmas. So the trees stay up, everything stays up. Because it's a good feeling, you know? Christmas is a good feeling. Welcome, everybody on TikTok. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, everybody on the other two sites that I broadcast today. Let's have some fun. Grab some hot cocoa. I know it's mid-afternoon. Grab some hot cocoa. Grab your fuzzy wuzzies. Sit down on the couch. Turn the lights down low, and let's read some spooky holiday stories, okay? All right, here we go. This is, again, from The Spirits of Christmas, The Darkside of the Holidays by Sylvia Shuts. The Disappearance of the Stoddard Children. Again, I'll be reading for about an hour. TikTok, double tap that screen for me. Let's see how many likes we can get for the show. Help me out here. Show me some love. Show me some love, TikTok. Show me some love. There are 6 faces on the billboard. 5 children, a young man, a tantalizing glimpse of what could have been. The young man glances upwards, and his lips seem ready to curve into a smile. He's a good-looking kid, and a dead ringer for the solemn boy in the middle of the group of 5. But the 5 children aren't smiling. The youngest girl seems especially pensive. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. These are the Stoddard kids. Their story is a curious, deeply frustrating mix of tragedy, hope, and loss, and terrible yearning. Their story began in flames and ended in mystery. They are all dark-haired, dark-eyed, beautiful children. And on Christmas Eve, 1945, they disappeared. George and Jenny Stoddard are a well-respected, solidly middle-class couple. Italian immigrants both. They had built a wonderful life together in the New World. George was born Giorgio Saru in Tula, Sardinia, in 1895. He came to the U.S. in 1908, when he was 13 years old. His older brother came with him as far as Ellis Island, then returned to Italy, leaving George on his own. The resourceful young teen found work on the railroad in Pennsylvania, carrying water and supplies to the workers. George later moved to Smithers, West Virginia. He was smart and ambitious, and soon he had started his own trucking company, hauling freight and coal. One day, George went into a store called the Music Box and met the owner's daughter, Jenny Cipriani. She had been just 3 years old when her family came to the U.S. George and Jenny married and had 10 children between 1923 and 1943. Busy. The rapidly growing family moved to Fayetteville, West Virginia. The little Appalachian town had a small but active Italian immigrant population. The Stoddards quickly became one of the most respected families in the community. George was admired as a responsible businessman and a devoted father to his brood. He wasn't afraid to share his opinions, but in one area he was curiously silent. He avoided any talk of his past in the old country, and he never discussed why he chose to leave Italy. On Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sauter children opened their presents. 9 of the 10 children were still at home. One boy was serving in the army. But as World War II had ended that August, he was safe from harm. George and 2 of the boys, John and George Jr., went to bed early. The 2 boys helped their father in his trucking business. The other children were far too keyed up to sleep. They finally went to bed around 10 p.m. to dream of more Christmas cheer in the morning. Jenny took 2-year-old Sylvia, the youngest child, to her bedroom and put her down in her crib for the night. Jenny, too, went to bed. Around 12:30, the phone in George's office rang. Jenny woke up and went to answer it before the shrill noise woke up the kids. An unfamiliar female voice was on the other end of the line. There seemed to be a party going on wherever the caller was. Jenny could hear raucous laughter in the background and the clink of glasses. Jenny sleepily told the woman she had the wrong number and hung up. On her way back to bed, Jenny noticed that the downstairs lights were on. The curtains were open and the front door was unlocked. She put everything to rights. Marion was asleep on the couch in the living room, and Jenny assumed the other children rolled tucked into their beds in the upstairs bedrooms. She went back to bed. As Jenny was drifting toward sleep, she heard one loud, sharp bang on the roof and a rolling noise. It sounded like something had hit the peak of the roof and rolled down to the gutter. Jenny listened, but no other noise came to her waiting ears. Her eyes closed and she fell asleep, listening to the baby's soft breathing. An hour later, she woke up again, this time with the sense that something was terribly wrong. Then she realized that heavy smoke was curling into the room. She snatched Sylvia from her crib and hurried out of the bedroom, shouting for George. George met her out on the front lawn. John and George Jr. were also there, singed but safe. They shared an upstairs bedroom and had made their way downstairs through the roaring flames, at the cost of only some singed air. Marion, too, was safely outside, but the roll call was dreadfully incomplete. 5 children. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were still in the house. The middle children shared 2 bedrooms on either end of the upstairs hallway, rooms that were separated by a staircase, and that staircase was now engulfed in flames. George couldn't get back into the house through the door, so he broke a window, heedless of the glass that stripped the skin from his arm. The flames were still too intense for him to get into the house that way. George assumed, as did Jenny, that the middle children were still in their bedrooms, trapped by the encroaching flames. He knew he had to get upstairs. He knew he had to get to their bedrooms. He raced around to get a ladder. He kept propped up against the side of the house, but it was gone. George was running out of options, and the fire department was nowhere in sight. He came up with a desperate plan. He would drive one of his coal trucks up to the house and stand on it to get to the upstairs windows. But, despite having been running only hours before, neither one of his 2 trucks would start. Frantic, George tried to scoop water from a rain barrel next to the house, but the water was frozen solid. He could only stand helpless and watch his home burn. He couldn't even hear the children screaming. Meanwhile, Marion sprinted to a neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department, but she couldn't get a hold of the operator. Another neighbor, who saw the fire as he was driving past, drove to a nearby tavern to call the fire department. Again, the operator wouldn't answer. Seething with frustration, the neighbor hopped back into his truck and drove into town. He woke Fire Chief F.J. Morris and told him that the Sauter home was on fire and that children were still inside. The chief didn't know how to drive the fire truck, so he raised the alarm by using the fire department's phone tree. He called one fireman, who called another, and so on. The fire department was only 2.5 miles from the Sauter home, but the truck didn't get there until 8 a.m. Christmas morning. By then, the house was nothing but a charred, smoking hole in the ground. The Sauter's home had been destroyed in less than 45 minutes. George and Jenny were devastated. The distraught parents assumed that 5 of their children had died in the fire. By 10 a.m., Chief Morris had finished his investigation of the ruins. He hadn't found any human remains, but he assured the Sauters that the fire had been hot enough to incinerate the bodies. He told the grieving parents to leave the site untouched, in case the fire department needed to investigate again. George waited for 4 days, but Morris didn't return. George covered the rubble in the basement with 5 feet of dirt, intending to plant a memorial garden for his lost children. On December 30th, 1945, the coroner's office issued 5 death certificates. They all gave fire or suffocation as a cause of death. But as the pain and horror of those first few days began to recede, George and Jenny Sauter realized that many questions were yet unanswered, and they couldn't shake the feeling they had that their children were still alive. As they pieced together the events leading up to the fire, some strange occurrences stood out. A few months earlier, in the fall, a stranger had come to the Sauter home, looking for work with George's trucking company. He didn't get the job, but during his conversation with George, the stranger wandered to the rear of the house. He pointed at the fuse boxes and casually said, "This is going to cause a fire someday." George shrugged off the remark. The fuse boxes had just been inspected by the local power company, and they were in perfect condition. Harder to dismiss was another visitor who had come by the house at about the same time. This fellow was an insurance salesman who tried to sell the Sauters a life insurance policy. When George declined the offer, the man was furious. "Your GD house is going to go up in smoke," the man snarled, "and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to be paid for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." It was true. George, a proud Italian, was an outspoken critic of the fascist dictator. And just before Christmas, the older Sauter sons had noticed a car parked along U.S. Highway 21. A man sitting in the car had been watching the younger children with unusual intensity as they came home from school. More questions arose. With later investigation, the official cause of the fire was faulty wiring. But Jenny had seen lights on downstairs just an hour before the fire started. A telephone repairman showed the Sauters something interesting. Their phone lines had not been burned through, but rather had been cut, 14 feet off the ground and 2 feet from the utility pole. The ladder that was usually kept leaning against the house, the ladder that was missing when George tried to rescue his children, was found in a ravine near the house, and the man was accused of stealing a block and tackle from the Sauter property during the fire. Equipment that could easily have been used to dismantle the Sauter company trucks. Later, toddler Sylvia found a hard green rubber object in the yard. Jenny remembered the bang on the roof and the rolling sound. George identified it as a napalm pineapple bomb, and it seemed to the Sauters that the fire had consumed their house from the roof downwards. Most frustrating of it all was the lack of physical evidence of the children's deaths. Jenny especially just couldn't wrap her mind around it. How could 5 children perish in a fire and leave behind no bones at all? Out of curiosity, Jenny began to experiment. She burned bones from the family's dinner table, chicken bones, pork chop bones, even the joint from a beef roast, and the results were always the same. The fire never consumed the bones entirely. Jenny put the question to an employee at a crematorium, who confirmed what she had suspected. Even when the body is cremated on purpose, burned for 2 hours at a constant 2,000 degrees, there are still charred bones left behind. The Sauter house fire was intense, but it raged fiercely for half an hour or so. It took only 45 minutes to burn to the ground. Also, Jeannie had found household appliances in the basement rubble. The metal was charred, but still identifiable. To add to the mystery, people began to come forward with possible sightings of the children. A woman claimed she saw the missing children in a passing car while the house was still burning. Another woman, who ran a tourist rest area between Fayetteville and Charleston, said she saw the children the morning after the fire. She told police that she served them breakfast and that she had noticed a car with Florida plates in the rest stop parking lot. More tantalizing to hearsay came from Charleston, about 50 miles west of Fayetteville. A woman who worked at a hotel there saw pictures of the missing children in a newspaper. She came forward to say that she had seen 4 of the 5 kids a week after the fire. In her statement, she said, "The children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian extraction. I don't remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in one large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking. I sensed that I was being frozen out And so I said nothing more. They left the next morning. In 1947, George and Jenny asked the FBI for help. They received a personal letter from J. Edgar Hoover, but his reply was not encouraging. He wrote that it seemed to be a local case and not within the FBI's jurisdiction. This despite the Sodders' insistence that the children had been kidnapped and taken across state lines. A few FBI agents said they'd be willing to help with the case if they could get permission from local authorities, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments both refused the offer of federal help. The Sodders hired a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, who turned up some very interesting facts. He found that the insurance salesman who had threatened George Sodder was also on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. This was intriguing, but Tinsley wasn't finished. He heard some interesting information regarding Fire Chief F.J. Morris from a minister in town. Morris had claimed that no human remains had been found at the site of the fire, but he let it slip to the minister that he'd found a heart in the ashes. He said he'd hid it in a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. This egregious act got Tinsley's attention immediately. He confronted Morris and persuaded him to return to the site and dig up the box. Morris did, with Tinsley at his side. They took it to a funeral director who found that it was not a heart at all. In fact, it wasn't even human. It was simply a chunk of beef liver. Later, the Sodders heard rumors that Morris had been desperate to find or plant any remains at the site, thinking that would placate the grieving parents and get them off his back. In 1949, Tinsley and the Sodders, along with Washington, D.C. pathologist Oscar B. Hunter, did a thorough evacuation of the fire scene. The search uncovered several small objects, coins, a partially burned dictionary, and several shards of bone. Hunter sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institution for further examination. Their report determined that the bones represented 4 lumbar vertebrae from one individual who was at least 16 to 17 years old, but no older than 23. Again, this made no sense. The oldest missing child was Maurice, who was only 14 at the time of the fire. The report said it was possible, but not probable, that the bones of a 14-year-old boy could show the maturation of a 16-year-old. To further complicate things, the bones showed no signs that they'd ever been exposed to fire. Whoever wrote the report even found it strange that in a situation where searchers expected to find evidence of 5 bodies, the only sign of any remains were 4 vertebrae. The report concluded that the bones were probably in the fill dirt that George had bulldozed over the burnt-out to create a memorial garden for his children. Tinsley later managed to trace the bones to a cemetery in Mount Hope, West Virginia. What bones from an unidentified grave were doing in the dirt at the Sodder home was just another part of the mystery. The case of the missing Sodder children was declared hopeless by Governor Okie L. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett. But the Sodder family hadn't yet given up hope. In 1952, they put up a billboard along U.S. Highway 16 near Ansted, West Virginia. The solemn faces of the missing children gazed from the billboard as the headline above them shrieked. What was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? The family handed out flyers advertising a $5,000 reward. Later, they increased the amount to $10,000. Slim leads crept in from time to time. George saw a picture of some schoolchildren in New York City and swore he recognized his daughter Betty, the youngest of the missing children. He went to Manhattan to investigate, but the parents of the girl refused to speak to him. A letter came from St. Louis. A woman said that Martha, the oldest missing daughter, was in a convent there. In Texas, a tavern patron overheard a conversation about a mysterious Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia. And from Florida, word came that the children were staying with distant relatives of Jenny's. George investigated every single lead, but every time his search came up empty. Then, in 1968, over 20 years after the fire, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed only to Jeannie. It bore a Kentucky postmark, but no return to address. Jenny opened the mysterious envelope. Inside was a photograph of a dark-haired, dark-eyed young man in his mid-20s. Jenny turned the photograph over with trembling fingers. On the back was a cryptic note. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Little boys, a 90132 or 35. If this was a secret message from Louis, sent to reassure his family of his safety, it didn't answer many questions. But the young man in the picture bore an undeniable resemblance to Louis Sodder. who was 9 years old at the time of the fire. In fact, he was very nearly 10. He would have celebrated his birthday 5 days later. George and Jenny hired another detective and sent him off to Kentucky to investigate. They never heard back from the man. Nevertheless, they added the picture of the handsome young man to the billboard on U.S. Highway 16. And they enlarged the photo and hung it over the fireplace. The boy so did look like Lewis. And if there was even a slim chance it was him, now they had a tenuous connection with one of their missing children. Every single clue pinpointed to the 5 Sodder children having survived the fire. All the evidence shouted that they were still alive and out there in the world somewhere. But where? Aside from that one cryptic photograph and a handful of possible sightings, the Sodder children were gone, like wisps of smoke in the wind. George Sodder died in 1968. He never stopped believing that someday his children would come home to him. Jenny retreated into her home and built several additions onto it, making a bulwark between herself and the world. She wore the black of mourning from the day after the fire until her own death in 1989. After Jenny's passing, the family took the billboard down. By that time, there was really no use in leaving it up any longer. The last Sodder child, Sylvia, is in her early 70s. She still keeps tabs on any possible news about her missing siblings. There are no ghosts in this story, only a deep and abiding mystery. There are no ghosts, only 2 grieving parents who lost half their family in one terrifying night. There are no ghosts, unless you count the 5 young faces that kept watch from the billboard for so many lonely years. Their solemn gazes, staring down the West Virginia highway. There are no ghosts, only questions. The Weinkauf Hotel Fire. We have a sip of water, and away we go. They're spooky and sad stories. Okay. In the first half of the 20th century, the United States was haunted by fire. The memory of 1911 was still fresh in the public mind. That was the year that fire had broken out on the top 3 floors of the 10-story Ash building. The building touted as fireproof had failed to live up to its billing, and 146 employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, 120 of them young women, had died in the blaze. The early years of 1940s had especially been lethal. In 1940, 198 people had been killed in a fire at a dance hall in Natchez, Mississippi. 2 years later, in November 1942, the Coconut Grove Club in Boston was the scene of the deadliest nightclub fire in history, when 492 people died and hundreds more were injured. And on July 6, 1944, 168 people, mostly women and children, perished when fire broke out in a Ringling Brothers circus tent in Hartford, Connecticut. 2 years after that, the possibility of fire was still very much on people's minds. But life goes on. In early December 1946, soldiers were coming home from Europe and the Pacific and Europe and the Pacific, And America was still celebrating the Allied victory in World War II. The country was just entering the post-war boom, and people were eager to start their Christmas shopping. The Weinkauf Hotel on Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta was sold out for the weekend. Folks had come to Atlanta for an early start on Christmas shopping, and high school students from all over the state were in town for a youth assembly, sponsored by the YMCA at the Georgia State Capitol. The hotel was packed, with 280 guests in the building's rooms. The Weinkauf Hotel, built in 1913, was 15 floors high, a steel structure enclosed in concrete. This absolutely fireproof hotel was designed and built without sprinklers, fire escapes, or an alarm system. However, the building met code. So when the fire completely destroyed the magnificent Weinkauf mansion on Peachtree Circle on December 8th, William F. Weinkauf and his wife, Grace, moved into the penthouse on the 16th floor of their newly built hotel. The Weinkaufs were probably pretty conscious of fire safety after the loss of their lavish mansion. At any rate, they felt secure enough in the hotel's design to make it their new home. But when a fire broke out on the 3rd floor in the early morning hours of December 7th, it spread quickly through the building. The single central staircase acted as a hellish chimney, directing toxic smoke to the upper floors. Flames through the rooms filled with wooden furniture, upholstered chairs, draperies, and wooden Venetian blinds. The walls of the rooms were covered with painted burlap fabric, from the wooden baseboard to a chair rail for 4 feet above the floor. From the chair rail to the ceiling, the walls were covered up with up to 5 layers of wallpaper. Wooden molding provided a decorative touch where the walls met the ceiling. The voracious fire devoured it all. The Atlanta Fire Department got an alarm call at 3:42 a.m. Fire Chief Charles Stryon arrived on the scene with the first trucks. He soon sent out a second alarm call, then a third. Styron eventually summoned help from the fire departments outside the city. More than 40 fire trucks converged on the scene. 32 pumping engines, 4 aerial ladder trucks, 6 service ladder trucks, a floodlight truck, and a salvage and rescue truck. The aerial ladders would be crucial in saving lives because the Weinkauf had no fire escapes. The city fire department only had 5 aerial ladders. The problem was that the ladders on the trucks were too short. Chief Styron had been trying to order an additional 85-foot ladder truck for several years, but with factories retooled for war production, there was simply none to be had. Styron believed that any ladder over 85 feet long was unsafe. He knew that 2 longer ladders had collapsed under their loads in other cities. And indeed, during the fire, the city's longest aerial ladder truck, with a 100-foot ladder, went out of service when the hydraulic system failed. Styron quickly moved an 85-foot ladder into position on Ellis Street to replace the longer one, leaving 2 trucks on Peachtree Street, a 75-foot ladder and a 55-foot mini aerial. But all this maneuvering was in vain, because the Weinkauf Hotel was 155 feet tall. The fire truck's ladders were simply and tragically too short to save people trapped on the upper floors. The ladders couldn't reach guests above the 8th floor. People above that floor had 3 options. They could fashion sheet ropes and slide down them to the tops of the ladders. They could wait out the fire and hope that the firefighters could save the building. Or they could jump for a net. People who chose to jump from the lower floors were generally okay, but the nets were not designed to catch jumpers from higher floors. Many nets ripped on impact, spilling victims onto the pavement. Also, many people didn't realize how hard it would be to hit a target from 80 feet or more in the air. At the front of the building, the marquee was in the way of the jumpers. One woman, aiming for a net, impaled herself on a steel cable jutting from the marquee. Some would-be rescuers tried to put boards and ladders between the windows of the hotel and the windows of the mortgage company next door. This worked, but barely. The heights of the floors didn't match, and the ladders ended up canted at a 30-degree angle over a 10-foot distance. Some people did try to wait out the fire, trusting the firefighters to do their job and save the building. One man and 2 women in a room tried to wet down everything they possibly could so that the room wouldn't explode when the fire's gases were ignited by the heat. They filled the tub and the sinks with water and stopped up the toilet. But when the mattress began to smolder and the water standing on the floor near the door started to boil, they decided it was time to leave. One man, Reed Home, went to a window, took out his wallet, and pulled out 5 $20 bills. One by one, he wadded them up and dropped them out the windows of his room, trying to aim so the bills would land at the feet of 5 different people. He figured some people deserved to be lucky that morning. Reed and his wife, Carrie, survived the fire and were let out of the building by firemen when the fire was out. Other people took their chances with sheet ropes. Gladys Mitchell, on the 16th floor, put her long black fur coat on over her nightgown before trying to climb down a sheet rope to an aerial ladder. Ann Smith was climbing down the rope after her. Ann lost her grip and fell, knocking Gladys off on the way down. Ann's body plummeted to the street, but Gladys's left arm hit the steel cable supporting the Weinkauf sign. The cable snapped under the impact, and the ricochet wrapped the end of the cable around her arm. The long sleeve of the fur coat prevented Gladys's arm from being ripped off and saved her life. From the first alarm at 3:42 a.m. until 6:04 a.m., when the last flames were doused, the Weinkauf Hotel fire officially lasted 142 minutes. The death toll was 119, an average of 1 death nearly every minute. 32 guests died from injuries suffered from falling or jumping. 40 suffocated on toxic fumes, and 37 were listed as burn fatalities. Although it was believed they had succumbed to fumes before being burned, more than 80% of the deaths happened above the 8th floor, beyond the reach of the aerial ladders. 16 people died on the 12th floor alone. 40% of the Weinkauf's more than 280 guests had died. William and Grace Weinkauf themselves were among the casualties. They perished in their 16th floor penthouse. A third of the survivors, 64 people, had to be hospitalized. Some of them died at the hospital, including 20-year-old Edith Birch, who died just before midnight on Sunday. She had been climbing down a sheet rope when she fell and plunged through the canopy of the hotel. She survived the fall, but broke both arms and legs and suffered internal injuries. Her husband, George Birch, had come down the sheet rope after Edith. He was at her side when she died at the hospital. They had been married 6 months. Nearly 90 bodies had to be removed from the building. Most victims on the lower and middle floors had burned after suffocating. One body was so hot, firemen had to hose it down before it could be lifted onto a stretcher. Charred flesh fell apart at the slightest touch. If the firemen found whiskey in the hotel rooms, they took swigs of it for courage. Firemen opened one door and found a pretty young woman sitting by the window. She was wearing a green dress, and her eyes were open. She appeared to be simply sitting near the window, calmly waiting for rescue. But she was dead. Several high school students perished in the fire. The parents of Frances Thompson and Gwen McCoy, 2 seniors from Gainesville, could not distinguish between the charred bodies of the 2 girls. The friends were buried together, and they shared a headstone. Authors Sam Hayes and Ellen B. Goodwin described the scene in their book, The Weinkauf Fire, The Untold Story of America's Deadliest Hotel Fire. The scene that met the firemen's gaze was one of utter, surreal devastation. Light bulbs had melted in the heat of the fire and dripped in long glass stalactites from their sockets. Telephones were shapeless blobs of black plastic. Wooden blades of ceiling fans had burned away. Clothes had turned to charcoal in hangers and closets. Toilets were cracked. The water in the necks of the fixtures had boiled, then turned to steam, and exploded the porcelain. On Christmas Day, 1971, 162 people died in a fire at the hotel. I'm not even going to go there with this name. I cannot pronounce it. It's a Korean name. Hotel T, we'll call it. It's Seoul, South Korea. With that tragedy, the Weinkauf Hotel no longer held the dubious honor of being the worst hotel fire in the world. It remains, however, the worst in the United States history. Deep stuff. Here's another story. The fire at Our Lady of the Angel School. Whoa, I hate this school. Moving on. It's water, TikTok. Queen of Heaven Cemetery in the Chicago suburb of Hillside is a beautiful restful spot, green in the Illinois summer and dotted with color from the flowers left at the graves of loved ones. It's a place to reflect on lives lived and lost, a place where the living can go find peace and comfort, a place where the dead can be remembered with dignity. One of the countless memorials here is a blocky stone monument covered with names. The Virgin Mary stands in high relief on one side of the block, her head bowed and her hands outstretched in welcome. This is not a fancy Renaissance-style sculpture. Mary is dressed in a simple robe, and a small halo shines behind her veiled head. The message of the monument is simple too. Our Lady of the Angels, pray for us. This is the memorial to the 92 students and 3 nuns who perished in the fire at Our Lady of the Angels grade school on December 1st, 1958. This tragedy led to a complete overhaul of school safety regulations. It is still considered one of the most awful and horrifying events in Chicago's history. The Blessed Virgin Mary Order of Nuns was founded in 1833 by Sister Mary Frances Clark. In 1867, the order, devoted to education, began serving in the Chicago Archdiocese. The nuns of the order were very concerned about fire safety, and with good reason. In 1870, their mother house in Dubuque, Iowa, had burned to the ground. Since then, for 88 years, every member of the order included in their daily prayers a request that they and their students be spared from fire. Our Lady of the Angels Grade School at 3820 West Iowa Street in Chicago's Humboldt Park neighborhood was one of the schools served by these nuns. Many Catholic families attended the school, with siblings filling several grades. 1958 was right in the middle of the baby boom, too, with around 1,400 students enrolled at the school. Classrooms were very overcrowded. Sister Davidus recalled that when the Monsignor came to her classroom to hand out report cards, she had to thread her way between an extra couple of rows of desks to meet him at the classroom door. December 1st, 1958, was a cold, cloudless day in the Chicago suburbs. It was a Monday, and the students were back at their desks after the weekend. The children had eaten lunch, and afternoon classes had begun. The fire began after 2:20 p.m. in a 30-gallon trash can at the bottom of a stairwell. The cardboard trash can, with metal rings at the top and bottom to hold it together, was full of paper. After burning through all the paper, the fire smoldered for a while in the confined space under the stairwell. 3 walls covered in sheet metal reflected and intensified the heat. The heat continued to build, and finally a window shattered. Oxygen was sucked into the area, causing the smoldering fire in the garbage can to flare up. The flames spread to the wooden staircase, varnished woodwork and walls covered in 14 layers of paint. The top 2 layers were particularly flammable. Custodians had used a rubberized plastic paint. As it burned, it produced a heavy toxic black smoke. The stairwell turned into a giant chimney. The fire was stopped from entering the first floor quarter by the fire doors, but it swept up the stairway and devoured the 85-foot-long hallway that led to the second floor of classrooms, burning at over 1,400 degrees. One reason the fire was such a deadly inferno was because of the roof. Over the years, the roof had been sealed several times with hot tar, the new layer being poured over the old. If the old tar had been stripped off before applying the new roof, the fire could have burned through the roof and vented itself. As it was, the multiple layers of tar acted as an impermeable seal, great for keeping rain off and fire in. Under that seal, the fire was trapped, an insatiable dragon roaring out of control. Hot air and gases continued to flow up from the basement. They were inside the wall now, feeding through an open shaft that had once held a drinking fountain, now disconnected. The flames filled the small attic above the second-floor ceiling, moving towards the 6 classrooms. In the north, wing packed with 329 students and 6 teachers. These secondary flames found their way through 2 ventilation grilles in the ceiling and dropped down into the second-floor hallway, joining the primary fire. The first sign of trouble in room 209 came when a student was going about his daily chore of collecting waste paper from his classmates. When he bent to pick up the metal garbage basket near the back of the room, for some reason the basket felt hot. Just then, another student told Sister Davidus, the teacher, that he smelled something burning. When the teacher and student tried to open the door to the hallway, smoke poured into the classroom. The inferno raged through the second-floor hallway. The glass transom windows over the classroom doors shattered from the intense heat. Smoke and flames poured into the classrooms over the transoms, caught the flammable ceiling lights on fire, and forced the students towards the windows. Here, younger students ran into their own difficulties trying to escape the flames. The window ledges were 37.5 inches off the floor, too high for little kids to scramble over. Some students, trusting their teacher when she told them to pray for help, sat quietly at their desks as they'd been told, folded their hands, and prayed, watching as the paint on the walls changed color from white to tan to brown. Firemen fought their way into one classroom to find 24 children sitting dead at their desks. Their books were still open in front of them. The fire alarm rang only inside the school. It didn't transmit a signal to the fire department. When the fire trucks did arrive, they went first to the wrong address, because a housekeeper had phoned in the alarm from the rectory next door to the school. The scene that met the firefighters was among the worst ever encountered by first responders in the history of American fire service. The smoke conditions were horrifying, even for trained professionals. Thick black toxic smoke poured from the building, making entry difficult. And breathing apparatus equipment for the firefighters didn't exist in 1958. It might not have helped anyway. According to the fire chief, who fought the blaze, it wouldn't have made any difference. That smoke was so bad, all you would have had was a bunch of dead firemen. The firefighters tried their best, though. They rescued 160 students from the flames. The injured students and teachers were taken to St. Anne's and to other hospitals on the city's west side. St. Anne's, being the closest to the school, ended up with the most casualties, almost twice as many as the other hospitals combined. Luckily, the fire happened during the 3 o'clock shift change, meaning that twice the number of hospital staff was present when the injured started pouring into St. Anne's. At St. Anne's, 37 children and 3 nuns were admitted. Of those, 10 children and 1 nun were dead on arrival. 2 more students died before they could be admitted. The number of victims was horrifying. 90 students and 3 nuns were injured, not only from burns and smoke inhalation, but also from jumping to escape the fire. The deaths were even more appalling. The fire claimed the lives of 92 children and 3 nuns. The school was woefully unprepared for a fire. There were no smoke detectors and no sprinkler system. There were fire doors, but the only one on the first floor. And there was only 1 fire escape for the entire building. Unbelievably, the school had passed a safety inspection only 2 months before the fire. The response to the fire was immediate. At Cook County Jail, inmates lined up to donate blood. At Stateville Prison in Joliet, inmates gave up their cigarettes and candy rations, donating that money to the fire fund. The tragedy was also reported all over the world. The BBC called the fire too awful for words. The response of the Catholic Church, meanwhile, was somewhat muted, although the Archdiocese was just as devastated by the tragedy as neighborhood families were. They were ill-equipped to provide any real relief. Catholic charities sent priests and nuns out into the neighborhood, but their role was to console the survivors, not to provide counseling for them. Consolation was needed as well as counseling. One of the most heart-wrenching tales to arise from this tragedy was the experience of Stanley Burda. On the day of the fire, Burda was occupying a bed in Cook County Hospital on Polk Street. This was a place where folks down on their luck could come for inexpensive health care, and Burda had had more than his share of bad luck recently. A week or so before, Burda had been laid off from his job at Bowman Dairy. This worried him, as he had a wife and 4 kids to support. Then, on the day after Thanksgiving, he'd been chopping wood in the basement, and a piece of metal, either from the axe or a stray nail, flew up and struck his left eye. Burda was taken to Cook County, where he had an operation to remove the shard of metal from his eye. As he lay in the hospital after the surgery, Burda must have been asking himself, what else could possibly go wrong? That's when a priest came in and told Burda that his older child, 13-year-old Beverly Ann, had been killed in the fire at Our Lady of the Angels. She'd been taken to the Cook County morgue and was now lying on a cold metal table right across the street from the hospital where her father had his eye operation. Burda clambered out of his hospital bed and went in search of his doctor. He had to go home, had to be with his wife. His doctor released him, but he warned Burda not to cry. If you cry, the salt from your tears might scald your eye. If that happens, it could blind you. Burda's response, God's will be done. Some of the parishioners of Our Lady of the Angels found it difficult to accept God's will in the weeks and months after the tragedy. For the children who escaped the fire, survivor's guilt was also compounded by the religious teachings of the Catholic Church. The nuns explained to the children that only the good ones were taken. Using kid logic to puzzle this out, many survivors came to the conclusion that if the good ones had died, and if they themselves had survived, then they must be bad. Of the survivors, Mary Jane Nucio Cozy was in the 5th grade at the time of the fire. She escaped the fire unharmed. She shared her feelings years later. The ones who died were called the lucky ones, the chosen ones. They were the ones God wanted. Those of us who lived weren't chosen. They were the angels. We were the kids who were left behind. And the parents whose children had died were being handed a lot of nonsense, too. They were being told their child was now an angel in heaven. But they were angry as hell about it. Yet, how could they be angry if that's what God wanted for them? Shame on you if you're crying on being angry when God chose your child. When you really are a blessed person, because you've got your own personal angel in heaven. It was so backward, so ludicrous. Guys, don't turn me into the internet police, okay? I'm just reading what's written here, okay? This woman does extensive research, okay, for her books. So don't, Hi, Shirley. So don't get all your panties in a bunch. The fire at Our Lady of the Angels school gave rise to many amazing stories. Some parishioners had mysterious premonitions. One mother had an unsettling vision of her small son in a casket on the evening before the fire. Linda Malinsky, 10 years old and in the 5th grade, woke up crying from a nightmare Sunday night. When her mother came running to see what was wrong, Linda cried, "Mommy, I can't breathe." Linda had asthma, and it had woven its way into her dream. She had a nightmare that her family's apartment was on fire and filling with smoke, and she woke up coughing. Her mother calmed her down, reassuring the young girl that everything was fine. As Linda calmed down, she sleepily mumbled, "Mommy, I hear people screaming." Linda and her brother both stayed home from school, sick Monday morning, but felt better after lunch. Mary Malinsky took her children's temperatures and decided they were both well enough to go to school for afternoon classes. Linda died in the fire. Her brother survived. There were several reports of crisis apparitions at the time of the fire. One woman said that her parents had come to the school to look for her and her brother. They found the girl, and the mother looked up to see the boy running towards his parents with a big smile on his face. In the milling confusion, though, the parents lost track of the boy. Hours later, they learned to their horror that he hadn't left the school at all. He had died in a second-floor classroom. To her dying day, the woman's mother was convinced she'd seen her son outside the school that day. Another story tells of a boy who searched frantically for his sister in the chaos outside. He spotted her a block away, walking in the direction of their home. He sagged with relief of knowing his sister was safe. But when he got home, he found out that his sister had indeed perished. Many of the little ghosts came back with words of comfort for their grieving families. "Don't worry," one girl's spirit told her devastated brother. "I'm going to watch over you." Another ghost sat with his mother and held her hand after she had been to the morgue to identify his body. People still claim to smell smoke at the memorial in Queen Heaven Cemetery, where 25 of the children who died are buried. And a student at the school built to replace Our Lady of the Angels told of hearing screams in the hallway at the new school. She filled page after page of drawing paper with sketches of the faces she saw in her dreams, faces of the fire's victims. All right, I'm going to probably read one more, and we're going to call it a day. This is the Silver Bridge collapse. Okay, the Silver Bridge, 1,750 feet long, was a stretch of U.S. Highway 35 that connected Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Whoa, this is Mothman area, with Gallipolis, Ohio. The bridge spanned the Ohio River and was a major thoroughfare between the two states. Built in 1928, the bridge was famous for an excellent engineering achievement. Hundreds of cars carrying thousands of people drove over the bridge every day from 1928 until December 15, 1967. On that day, the bridge collapsed during the evening rush hour traffic at 4:55 p.m., sending 60 to 70 cars plunging into the frigid waters of the Ohio River. Only 5 people managed to escape their submerged vehicles and swim to safety. On the Ohio side, about 250 feet of the bridge slammed into the land, killing 4 people and injuring 8. Witnesses said the bridge listed sharply, throwing cars and trucks into the river, then collapsed with a slow-motion groan on top of the vehicles, grinding them into the mud at the bottom of the river. 46 people died when the Silver Bridge collapsed. Ben Cedar crossed the Silver Bridge 3 times on the day it collapsed. He worried every time he had to cross that bridge. It would often sway alarmingly, and if you got stuck in a traffic jam, there was simply nowhere to go. Cedar crossed the bridge just before 5 p.m. on December 15th. He stopped in Gallipolis, Ohio, at a Kroger store and used a payphone to check in with his office. He was a Kirby salesman. As he hung up the phone, he heard other store customers talking about a bridge collapse. Bill Needham was a 27-year-old truck driver from North Carolina who was on the bridge when it fell. His rig sank quickly to the bottom of the river. He held his breath until he could roll down the cab window. He wriggled into the pitch-black water and swam for the surface. He grabbed some floating debris, and after about 15 minutes, he was pulled onto the rescue boat. He was taken to Pleasant Valley Hospital with a broken back. Needham's driving partner, Robert Toe, was not as lucky. He was in the sleeping berth at the back of the cab and had strapped himself in. Toe had just built a new home for his wife and 3 small children and had bought a farm on December 15, 1967. That day was supposed to have been his last day as a long-haul trucker. And the most incredible thing about this disaster? It was caused by the failure of one tiny part of the whole massive thing. At the time of the bridge's construction, in 1928, people were driving Model Ts, which weighed about 1,500 pounds. Permitted truck truck weights in those days were around 20,000 pounds or 20 tons. But as time went on, cars and trucks both got bigger and heavier. By 1967, the average frame of the car weighed around 4,000 pounds, and truck limits were set at 60 tons or more. Traffic itself was heavier, with more drivers on the roads. Bumper-to-bumper traffic jams on the bridge stopped traffic flow several times a day, 5 days a week. This put even more stress on the structure. Investigators later determined that the entire bridge collapsed because of the failure of one single link, a single eye-bar in a suspension chain that had a defect 1/10 of an inch deep. For readers interested in cryptids, see, there is an intriguing postscript to this story. Some people believe that the Silver Bridge collapse of December 15, 1967 is linked to the Mothman sightings that began in that area in November 1966. Citizens in West Virginia reported sightings of a winged humanoid in the year before the disaster. Some say that Mothman sightings foretell impending doom. Others blame Mothman for actually causing the tragedy. Some go as far as to label it a demonic entity bent on leaving destruction and sorrow in his wake. The good folks of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, aren't taking any chances. The Mothman Festival is held every year in downtown Point Pleasant to celebrate the mysterious cryptid, whatever it is. All right, I feel like stopping there. Let me see how far we have to go in this book. This is not going to tell me, is it? Yeah, we're 140 of 321, so we're 43%. So there's still quite a ways in this book. We're going to be reading it probably the next 2 Sundays. But I would love to read the next one because, I mean, it's a classic ghost story. But I'm waiting on... Let me see something really quick, you guys. I wouldn't mind reading it. Let me hang on 1 second. My dinner guest is going with me, so I gotta see. Sometimes she'll come over early, and I still gotta change clothes. So let me see what's going on here, and then... Let me let her know I'm reading one more story. Give me just a second. There. All right. Let's read the next one, and this is a fascinating story because I had done my research on this, and the gentleman that wrote the story, who's now deceased, the original story, who's now deceased, really did his research. Really did his research. Marisa, if you're out there, I just sent a text message. Let me finish this thing, and then I gotta change my clothes before we go. Okay, just to let you know if you're listening. So here we go. The crash of Flight 401. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was on its way to Miami International Airport on the night of December 29th, 1972. The Lockheed TriStar was making its final approach when a panel light came on in the cockpit, signaling trouble with the landing gear. The pilot, Captain Robert Loft, and flight engineer Donald Repo weren't unduly concerned. The plane had only been in service for 4 months, and it was the pride of the fleet. Flight 401 was one of the most modern and technologically advanced passenger jets of its day. First Officer Albert Stockstill had been instructed to lower the landing gear. He did so, but not all the wheel indicator lights were green. Captain Loft figured it was probably a faulty bulb. Stockstill tried to remove the bulb, while Don Repo, who was a flight engineer, went down into the avionics bay to check visually to see if the landing gear was down. In all this calm problem-solving, none of the 3 men realized that the autopilot had shut off, and the plane was losing altitude over the alligator-infested Everglades. Flight 401 was going 227 miles per hour when it smashed into the swamp. Many passengers were killed on impact, as was First Officer Stockstill. Don Repo and Bob Loft survived the crash. When rescue teams reached the crash site several hours later, Repo was rushed to the hospital, but died of his injuries soon afterwards. Loft died at the scene of the crash before rescuers arrived. 98 passengers and crew members were killed when Flight 401 was lost. An official investigation into the accident concluded that the crash was caused by pilot error. Captain Loft was an experienced pilot. He had flown the TriStar models since their introduction, and he had over 30,000 hours experience in the cockpit. He had a dependable crew, too, but every man of the cockpit crew failed to monitor the jumbo jet's altitude as they tried to fix the problem with the undercarriage. Later, it was discovered that the nose wheel was down and locked at the time of the crash. Captain Loft had been right. The problem was a faulty bulb after all. The massive whisper liner was in pieces, but some of those pieces, like the galley, were still usable. Eastern Airlines decided to salvage those parts of the downed plane and install them in other aircraft, including Flight 318 and Flight 903. Flight engineers arrived before the other crew members to do pre-flight checks on the plane. One day, an engineer came on board and was puzzled to see an Eastern employee sitting in his seat. His puzzlement turned to shock when the man turned to face him, and the engineer recognized Don Repo. "You don't need to worry about the pre-flight. I've already done it," the dead man said. Then he vanished. Attendants on Flight 318 started seeing Captain Loft on their plane. One stewardess saw the captain standing in the aisle near the back of the plane. He turned around and looked at her with a smile, then faded away. The stewardess dropped in a faint. Another crewman said he heard the dead captain's voice come over the public address system, asking passengers to put on their seatbelts. Still another saw Loft's ghost sitting in a passenger seat, staring out the window. Crew members were not the only ones seeing ghostly apparitions. On 2 separate occasions, passengers flagged down passing stewardesses to let them know that the man sitting next to them, the one dressed in the uniform of an Eastern Airlines flight officer, looked horribly pale and sat there without moving or speaking. On both occasions, the stewardess dully checked the ill passenger and found nothing but an empty seat. And both startled passengers were shown the photographs of Eastern Airlines staff and identified Don Repo as the sick-looking man in the empty seat next to them. Several caterers loading N318EA for the next flight rushed off the plane and refused to get back on to finish their job. They had all seen a flight engineer in the galley who vanished in front of their eyes. The officials at Eastern Airlines were not at all pleased with the numbers of ghost stories being circulated around their planes. They threatened to fire any Eastern employee who was caught telling tales. This was a teensy bit hypocritical because a vice president of the company spoke with Captain Loft on a Miami-bound flight. As soon as he realized he was speaking with Loft, the ghost disappeared. But the stories continued to circulate. In 1974, an article about the haunted planes appeared in the newsletter of the U.S. Flight Safety Foundation, which was a further source of embarrassment for the company's top brass. But then the spirits of Bob Loft and Don Repo changed their tactics just slightly. They had just been appearing to crew and passengers, and sometimes scaring the paste out of them. But now, the Phantoms had a message for the living crew of the planes they haunted. Stewardess Faye Merriweather was working in the galley of Flight 903 on a jaunt from New York to Mexico City when she saw a weird reflection in the oven window. The galley had been refitted onto Flight 903, and this was the same oven that had been on Flight 401. The reflection wavered, then resolved itself into a face, the face of Don Repo. The face seemed to be trying to speak. More fascinated than frightened, Merriweather quietly got 2 of her co-workers, another stewardess, and an engineer, to come to the galley with her. When the 3 got back, Don Repo's face was clearer than ever. The apparition's lips twitched, and the ghostly face spoke. "Watch out for fire on this airplane," an eerie voice said in a hollow monotone. The flight arrived in Mexico City without incident, but the 3 crew members couldn't forget the ghostly warning. And on the return trip, they had reason to remember that warning. The plane was sitting on the runway in Mexico City, preparing for takeoff, when the starboard engine failed. The engine backfired several times, and the engineers quickly shut it down before it caught fire. It was Don Repo's spirit that appeared most often, always dressed in his Eastern Airlines uniform. He was usually seen sitting in the plane's first-class section or in the crew area, and sometimes in the cockpit. The Phantom always appeared calm and relaxed, but very concerned about the plane's safety. Often, the ghost manifested to make suggestions or give warnings to the plane's crew, who only realized they were dealing with the paranormal when Repo vanished after talking with them. Both Loft and Repo seemed to be haunting the planes to which they were still connected because of the crash that killed them. Perhaps they felt responsible for the deaths of the 96 people who perished with them in that humid, mucky swamp. Their message was always one of protection and of responsibility. They appeared on many occasions to warn crews about equipment malfunctions and impending danger. One captain was checking his instruments before a flight from Miami to Atlanta. Repo's face appeared floating in the cockpit in front of the astonished pilot. There will never be another crash of an L-1011, Repo assured the pilot. We will not let that happen. Eventually, all the parts that had been salvaged from Flight 401 were removed from the various planes that had received them. The spirits of Bob Loft and Don Repo were never seen again after that. Still, they kept their promise to protect Eastern's L-101s. The crash of Flight 401 on December 29, 1972, was the last fatal crash of the TriStar fleet. From 1972 until Eastern Airlines folded in 1991, there were no other crashes involving that fleet. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. I loved that story. I actually read a couple years ago. I read that book. Trying to get my stuff here so I can mark my thing, but it's not letting me. I want to bookmark it. Anyway, I want to let you guys go. I have plans for tonight. And I thank you all for coming today, because I realize it's your Sunday. But I do have plans for this evening, so whoa. Good thing I checked this, huh? TikTok almost killed me. Oh, come on. Leave it to TikTok. Okay. Anyway, I thank you guys for coming, and those of you on TikTok that listened. We will continue this next Sunday, part 6. Like I said, we're just about halfway through the book now. So, yeah, gives us something to read. Hi, guys. Hi, everybody in there. Anyway, I thank you so much. And on TikTok, I'm going to let you go, and I will see you guys tomorrow. I'm off tonight. Like I said, I will be doing tarot card readings tomorrow, 7 p.m. Pacific, over on TikTok. If you guys want to join me over there, that would be great. Southern California Haunts for you guys on the other 2 networks. So thank you very much, TikTok, and I'll see you tomorrow. Let me sign out here. All right, guys. I will see you guys. I have a guest. I will have some guests scheduled this week. Haven't gotten them up and completely scheduled yet, but I will have at least 2 or 3 guests on this week till we start rolling to have our guests back on 5 days a week. So I'm really excited about that to get that started. Anyway, thank you for coming. Look up California Haunts on TikTok and all the other social media networks. Check out our place on Clapper as well, because we're going to be doing lives over there. But thank you so much, guys. I'm going to end this show right now, okay? I will see you tomorrow, hopefully. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin.